By June 1944, the outlook was bleak for Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. The Eastern Front was chewing through men and resources, and the Soviets were closing in on German borders. In the West, the Allies were ready to launch Operation Overlord, their long-awaited invasion of northern France. But it was an invasion that Hitler had long expected, and he was confident he could hold the Allies off. He had been building up his coastal defenses, the famous Atlantic Wall, and although the German war machine was a wounded animal, it still had a vicious bite. But by the evening of D-Day itself, not even a full day into the invasion, the Allies had already stormed the beaches, secured their positions in northern France, and crushed Hitler's hopes of victory. So where did it all go wrong for the Germans? Why did they fail on D-Day? People often rush to pin it on the overwhelming advantages the Allies had in terms of men and material, poor military decisions the Germans made, or because Hitler was asleep when the landings were happening. And believe me, I'll get to all that. But I feel it's almost insulting to start the discussion without mentioning the insane levels of preparation and planning the Allies put into the operation, because if they didn't get that right, all that other stuff might not have mattered. After the fall of France in 1940, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill knew that an Allied invasion of Northern Europe was a must. The when, where and how would have to be figured out, but he was already envisioning the monumental task ahead, and he knew preparation was paramount. To work out the how, the British launched a number of practice operations, mini D-Days in a sense. Most notably, in August 1942, British and Canadian forces raided the French port of Dieppe. The idea was to test the German defences and give the Canadians valuable combat experience. It would end in disaster. Landing craft approached the beach under intense fire, tanks ended up stuck in the sand and shingle, and the few to make it to shore were helpless. More than 3,000 men were either captured or killed. That day, the Allies learned a costly but valuable lesson. A direct attack on a German port was out of the question. It also cemented that an invasion of Europe couldn't be rushed. Planning had to be meticulous, and that's exactly what it was. One of the main decisions Allied planners grappled with was the where. Where was the best location for the landings? With ports ruled out, two clear favourites soon emerged, Pas-de-Calais and Normandy, with Britain being the base to launch from. Pas-de-Calais was the logical choice, being the shortest sea crossing from England, but it was also the predictable choice, and the element of surprise was of utmost importance. If the Germans guessed correctly where the landing site might be, or worse yet, somehow learned of the Allies' plan even a day before D-Day, it could have been disastrous. The Germans could simply move all their forces to Calais or wherever, and concentrate all their might on a single point, giving them their best chance of pushing the Allies back into the sea before they can get a foothold on the beaches. So, the decision was made to land in Normandy, to wrong-foot the Germans. It was far less defended than Calais, it was still within range of air fighter support from England, and even though they were bringing their makeshift Mulberry harbours with them, if the Allies could capture the nearby town of Cherbourg quickly, they would have control of a vital port to ensure a steady stream of supplies and reinforcements, which would be essential to the operation's long-term success. Crucially, it was the less obvious of the two choices, and any attack there might be perceived as a feint. The key for the Allies now would be to keep the Germans guessing until the last minute. So they undertook a massive deception campaign called Operation Bodyguard, with the main goal of convincing the Germans that Pas-de-Calais was the main target. German double agents in Britain began feeding Hitler and his high command carefully selected pieces of false information, emphasizing that the primary Allied assault would come at Calais and a possible decoy attack at Normandy. To further sell the idea, a completely fake army was created, called the First Army Group, or FUSAG. It consisted of decoy troops and fake tanks and planes that were no more than blow-up toys or made of wood. This fake army was amassed in Kent, directly across the Channel from Calais. And of course, the Allies let German reconnaissance fly over and take photos. To go the extra mile, fake landing craft were placed in the harbours near Kent, and misleading radio transmissions that imitated the sound of an army were sent out so that Luftwaffe nearby could have easily picked them up. In terms of the when, the invasion was originally planned for June 5, 1944, but bad weather caused Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower to postpone for 24 hours. So June 6th it was. On the big day, the landings would be split into 5 zones. The Canadians and British would storm the 3 eastern beaches, codenames Gold, Juno, and Sword, with British and Canadian airborne troops dropping to their east, near the Caen Canal. The 2 western beaches, codenames Omaha and Utah, were to be assaulted by the Americans, with US airborne forces dropping to their west, at Sainte-Mère-Église. These airborne forces were being put through their paces, with paratroops and glider infantry undergoing 2 years of intense training, including a number of practice drops. Allied bombers were also softening up German targets in France from 1943. Targets were carefully selected to give the impression that Calais was of high interest. Further still, the Allies undertook a huge air reconnaissance operation, starting in 1943, gathering vital intelligence about German defences and landing sites. Men in small boats were even sent on stealth missions to collect sand samples from French beaches to make sure that tanks and vehicles wouldn't get bogged down as soon as they make it off the boat. The disaster at Dieppe showed the importance of getting the first wave of men and machines off the beaches and into the fight quickly. To solve that problem, the Allies developed a number of incredible contraptions that would help the troops get to shore and off the beaches, which came to be known as funnies. These included floating tanks, flail tanks for clearing obstacles and mines, and bobbin tanks that could drive over soft sand and lay paths for other vehicles, just to name a few. As the invasion drew closer, Allied troop numbers in Britain swelled to over 2 million, and war material of all descriptions was being amassed in unfathomable numbers. More on this later, when we compare both sides' militaries. All in all, the extent of the Allied preparation was immense, and no stone was left unturned. As you will see, the extraordinary lengths the Allies went to throw the Germans off their scent pays off big time and affects German preparations in the exact way that the Allies had hoped. Over the Channel, the Germans were well aware an invasion was on its way at some point, and their preparation was well underway too. Beginning in 1942, Hitler poured a lot of time, effort, and resources into the construction of his Atlantic Wall, a series of fortifications that ran along the European coast, from Spain to Denmark. This included gun emplacements, barbed wire, beach obstacles, and mines, many of which were in Normandy. Hitler made Field Marshal Erwin Rommel responsible for the wall's defences in late 1943. He immediately found that it left a lot to be desired and got to work strengthening it. Despite this, the wall still had a major drawback, much like the Maginot Line did for the French 4 years prior. Once the enemy break through the line of fortifications, the massive guns and bunkers pointing at the enemy, in this case out over the beaches, become useless. In reality, fortifications like the Atlantic Wall aren't meant to stop an invasion outright. If they can, great. But if they can slow the advance down a day or so, long enough to get your forces there and counterattack, then they have done their job. Either way, Hitler had faith that his wall would achieve one of these outcomes. He went as far as saying that he was the best fortification builder the world had ever seen. In total, roughly 3.7 billion Reichsmarks went into it, including millions of tons of steel and concrete, the equivalent of about $200 billion today. Resources that could have been far better spent elsewhere, like replenishing the Navy or Air Force as best as possible, which were both shadows of their former selves at this point. As a result, the task of defending northern France and the Atlantic Wall would fall primarily with the German army. But from 1941, roughly 2/3 of the entire German war machine was tied up on the Eastern Front, so many of the units that would end up stationed at the Atlantic Wall were poor-quality divisions that were unfit for other places like the Eastern Front. A decent chunk were merely volunteers or prisoners of war from German-occupied nations. The German hopes lay with the 9 Panzer and 1 Panzer Grenadier divisions available in northern France at the time, who had about 1,400 tanks between them. Most were formidable fighting forces and had some real advantages over the Allies. Many crews had battle-hardened men, with 4 years of savage warfare under their belts. Their tanks were also better than Allied armour, many being Tigers and the new formidable Panthers. By this stage in the war, many had 88mm guns that could tear through Allied armour from ranges where they couldn't be harmed themselves. The pivotal thing was, they had to be in a position to effect the battle quickly once the invasion began. If the Germans could get the bulk of these units to the landing site, as the initial landings were happening, they gave themselves the best chance of throwing the Allies back into the sea. However, for German generals, trying to agree on the best place to position the panzers before the invasion would prove a painful and costly undertaking. The rotten core of the German battle plan for the coming invasion was undoubtedly the command structure of the German army. The German forces on the Western Front didn't all report to the overall commander in the theatre, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, and this created massive problems. Von Rundstedt himself was in charge of Army Group G in the south of France and Army Group B, tasked with defending northern France and Belgium. However, Rommel commanded that very Army Group B, and as Hitler appointed him responsible for the Atlantic Wall and coastal defences, he couldn't be overruled by Rundstedt, despite Rundstedt being his superior. To muddy the waters even further, General Leo Gerr von Schweppenberg was in command of a number of panzer divisions, known as Panzer Group West. In theory, Rundstedt was above von Schweppenberg in the command structure too, but von Schweppenberg answered directly to Hitler. This meant that on D-Day, the movements of these divisions would have to be given the all-clear by Hitler first. Hitler subscribed to the idea that the strongest would survive or the cream would rise to the top, be it man, beast, or in this case generals and military units. He set up the command structure in a way as to not necessarily cooperate, but to have degrees of independence, to compete, fight, and challenge each other, so inevitably, the strongest, most ruthless would rise to the top. In a lot of instances, though, he reserved supreme authority for himself, many times over elite units. In terms of D-Day preparations, these things completely backfire on the Germans. The unclear command structure caused bitter arguments between the generals. They couldn't agree on the best defensive strategy. Rommel stressed that the only hope they had was to position the bulk of the panzers as close as possible to the most likely landing sites and launch an all-out counterattack on the beaches as the Allies were landing, driving them back into the sea before they could establish a foothold. However, von Rundstedt and von Schweppenberg disagreed. They argued for a defense-in-depth strategy where the panzers would be held back further inland until it became clear where the landing site was. They would then be unleashed in a huge armored fist of fury. Rommel vigorously challenged this and told Rundstedt to his face that he was clueless. Without air superiority, he continued, this big fist of fury will be wiped off the map before it even reaches the beaches. He had seen how ferocious Allied air power was during his campaign in Africa. Unable to come to an agreement, Rommel went behind von Rundstedt's back and appealed directly to Hitler. Unclear on the best course of action himself, Hitler eventually compromised with both of them. This was probably the worst possible outcome, resulting in the already limited and scattered troops being split up even further. Rommel was given 3 panzer divisions to have near the beaches of his choosing. The rest would remain further back in reserve, 4 with Panzer Group West under von Rundstedt and von Schweppenberg, and 3 more would go to Army Group G, south of the River Loire, whom Rundstedt also controlled. Ultimately, when D-Day finally arrived, Germany's most capable forces were horrendously scattered about France, many nowhere near striking distance of the likely landing sites, and the ones stationed in the south were so far away from the Atlantic Wall that they were irrelevant altogether. Regardless, both sides now had their boards set, and the Allied pieces were ready to move. But before we discuss the invasion, let's quickly compare both sides' militaries. The figures to follow underline Germany's need for a flawless plan and execution, and really put into perspective how highly the odds were stacked against them. On D-Day, over 150,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy by either air or sea. They had approximately 12,000 planes, 3,000 tanks, and were escorted by about 7,000 ships and boats. On the other hand, Germany had approximately 50 to 80,000 troops in Normandy at the time of the invasion. There were 1,400 tanks, 120 operational aircraft, and about 60 ships in the theatre, but not all in Normandy. So the Allies had colossal advantages, most glaringly, the Navy and Air Force, and most crucially, the Air Force. Control of the air, even before D-Day, meant that from April 1944, the Allies stepped up bombing operations against German targets in France with no major issues, including railways and bridges, softening up German positions and damaging their mobility. To jump ahead briefly, in the early hours of D-Day itself, before the troops landed, over 700 US bombers, escorted by thousands of fighters, unloaded over 2,000 tons of explosives on German coastal defenses. They were virtually uncontested by the Luftwaffe, who were outnumbered about 50 to 1. A massive naval bombardment followed. On D-Day, the Allies had 73 destroyers, 23 cruisers, and 9 battleships capable of launching huge artillery barrages. It was the last blow from distance before the troops would attempt to come ashore. The German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, with their 60-odd ships, could do nothing to respond. Allied air superiority confined most of the German fleet to their harbours, where they had no effect on the battle. All in all, the Allied military advantages were quite staggering. As I said before, everything really had to go perfectly for the Germans, and even if it did, that in no way guaranteed victory. The Allied fleet set sail for the French coast at around 6 AM on the 5th of June, roughly 24 hours before the landings would commence. The Air Force followed later that evening. The first Allied troops into the action were the airborne forces. Just after 1 AM on June 6th, roughly 24,000 paratroopers and glider infantry dropped behind enemy lines. The Canadians and British landed to the east of Sword Beach. Their mission was to capture vital bridges over the River Orne and Caen Canal before troops started landing. The drops were quite scattered, but they still managed to capture their objectives. To the west, US paratroopers were landing around the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, west of Utah Beach. They were tasked with securing the exit points around Utah, so the troops landing soon could move on to Cherbourg as quick as possible. Drops were also quite scattered. Some missed their drop zones completely. But they improvised, with men from different units banding together to achieve their objectives. 3 hours later, by about 4:30 a.m., Sainte-Mère-Église was in US hands, and the exits from Utah Beach were secured. An hour later, at around 5:30, the hearts of the German troops along the Normandy coast must have sunk to the bottom of the English Channel. In the distance, they spotted the Allied armada emerge from the mist. They had no clue the attack was coming. The Allies set off from England under the cover of darkness, and Allied deception tactics had German radar operators convinced that the main thrust was coming at Pas-de-Calais. By this stage, the Allied air and naval bombardment was well underway, and by 6:30 a.m., the first waves of troops hit the beaches. The Americans would be the first to arrive, landing at Utah and Omaha beaches, an hour before the British and Canadians would reach their sectors. The landings at Utah went smoothly, albeit helped by a stroke of luck. The troops accidentally landed in an area that was only lightly defended, and by 10 a.m., the beach was in US hands, and troops were linking up with US paratroops near Sainte-Mère-Église. Slightly to the east, however, at Omaha, the landings were pure carnage. The layout of the beach was all a defender could ask for. As the Americans landed, they were confronted by German defenders, including machine gunners, perched on top of cliffs over 100 feet high, many within concrete bunkers, where they had a perfect view over the beach, which itself was full of obstacles, mines, and barbed wire. Making it to shore and into the battle was near impossible, and casualties were tremendous. Bad weather and rough seas only added to the chaos. It became so bad at one point, General Omar Bradley thought about calling the attack off and rediverting troops to Utah instead. Slowly but surely, though, the Americans cracked the German defenses, and by evening, at a cost of nearly 2,500 dead, wounded, or missing, the beach was in Allied hands. It would be the deadliest of the 5 D-Day landing sites by a long stretch, and was a glimpse into what the Germans could have achieved if the beaches were defended more vigorously. An hour after the Americans, at about 7:30 a.m., the British and Canadians began landing on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Despite stiff resistance in some areas, they got the better of the German defenders there, relatively comfortably. By evening, all 3 beachheads were secure, and the British on Sword Beach were linking up with airborne troops near the Caen Canal. Overall, with the exception of Omaha, the initial Allied landing phase was a success. By early evening, all 5 of the beachheads were secure. The big question is, why hadn't the German panzers responded in force yet? The only substantial German armoured division within striking range of the initial landings was the 21st Panzer Division, which was a part of Rommel's Army Group B. However, as fate would have it, Rommel was away in Germany visiting his wife. He didn't think an attack was imminent due to the poor weather in the days prior. Coincidentally, his second-in-command, General Friedrich Dollmann, was over 100 miles away from Normandy at a training exercise. As a result, the counterattack the 21st Division conjured on D-Day was slow, badly mismanaged, and lacked any real coordination. It wasn't until after midday that they began their assault against the British near Caen, and it wasn't until 7 p.m. that one section had any real success, exploiting a gap between British and Canadian forces and reaching the coast at Lyon-sur-Mer. Although, with no reinforcements available, they were forced to fall back, but not before losing about 25% of their tanks. The only other German armour close enough to affect the battle on D-Day were 2 of the 4 reserve panzer divisions from von Rundstedt's and von Schweppenberg's Panzer Group West. Only they were nearly 200 miles away from Normandy and would need to be deployed quickly if they were going to have any impact. But they needed Hitler's permission to be moved. However, Hitler was asleep when the landing started, and it wasn't until midday that he learned about the invasion. He didn't take it seriously, though. He was still convinced the main attack was on its way to Pas-de-Calais. Finally, at about 4 p.m., when things were beyond clear, Hitler ordered 2 divisions from Panzer Group West to the coast, but they were too far away to provide immediate support. It was only on the 7th and 8th that they reached Caen and started actively participating in the area's defense. In fact, in the first 48 hours of the invasion, only about 400 of the 1,400 tanks the Germans had in the theatre saw any action. The Germans were so convinced that Pas-de-Calais was the main target that 2 of Rommel's 3 panzer divisions, or 2/3 of the entire force Hitler allowed to be stationed close to the beaches, were miles away from Normandy, closer to Calais, and were nowhere near close enough to arrive in time for the initial battles on June 6th, after which time, in my opinion, any chance of German victory had been and gone. As June 7th dawned, the Allies were moving inland. They had complete dominance over the skies, so as Rundstedt's panzer reinforcements moved towards Normandy, they were devastated by Allied bombers. So much so, they eventually abandoned daylight movement altogether. Not to mention, by the time they arrived, they had been so depleted, they were unable to mount a major counterattack. just as Rommel had feared. In the days following D-Day, the Allies began assaulting the vital towns of Caen and Cherbourg, and by the 12th of June, they had captured Carentan, linking all 5 beaches together. A steady stream of men and supplies were now entering northern France. Any hope Hitler had of throwing the Allies back into the sea had well and truly faded. The Allies pulled it off thanks to a combination of meticulous planning, a staggering material advantage, and of course, numerous German failures. Just how much the German failures contributed to their defeat is hard to quantify, though. Remember, even if things went perfectly for the Germans, even if they saw through the Allied deception tactics and had their panzers within striking distance of the landing sites, victory wasn't ensured. Sure, the Allies would likely have suffered a heck of a lot more casualties. We probably would have got 5 Omahas instead of 1. But there's a good chance the Allies would have cracked the German lines and established themselves on the beaches regardless. They just had so much men and material. Of course, we will never know, but the reality was, by June 6, 1944, the German war machine was in rapid decline. They were fighting on multiple fronts, and the sheer amount of men and resources going up in smoke on the Russian front alone was mind-boggling. I don't think they had enough sting in their tail at this point to repel the Allies on D-Day, even if things went perfectly. And even if they did, they certainly didn't have enough in the tank to win the war. The wheels were falling off long before D-Day. To see where it all started going horribly wrong for Nazi Germany, check out this video about Operation Barbarossa and the Eastern Front. Either way, that was phase, and as they say, the rest is history. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe.